What is the boldest thing you've seen someone do to greatly lower their cost of living? Hello everyone, write your opinion on this in the comments, as well as do not forget to subscribe to the channel. Enjoy watching. Story 1. I remember reading a story about a guy who had an internship at some big tech firm, I think Google, in an extremely HCOL area. He bought an old U-Haul and outfitted it for living. He parked in the company lot as obscurely as possible and moved every so often. Used the company showers and such. Probably the best way to manage that situation if you could handle it. Story 2. My best friend divorced his spendaholic wife, who had gotten them into over $50,000 of credit card debt and wanted to take out a second mortgage on the house to buy herself another car. He ended up with half the debt, of course, but he moved in with his sister and dug himself out after 4 years. He lives alone now and is the most careful person with money I've ever seen. She's being supported by her parents, who have her on a strict budget. She's almost 50 now. I shudder to think what will happen when they pass, and she inherits. Story 3. Depends what you mean by the boldest. I'd say the most audacious behavior I've seen was from my former roommate and ex-friend, Sarah, a narcissist and professional mooch, who used her then-friends to get a job, a cheap place to live, borrowed furniture, and even food, while also quietly stealing from us. I'm sure she effectively lowered her cost of living through the theft and manipulation. Story 4. I work EMS and recently had a coworker that also works part-time at neighboring fire department tell us about a coworker they had that moved out of his house and was living out the fire department. They did 24-hour shifts and each employee had a bedroom. This particular employee would just pick up as much overtime as possible, use the bedroom for sleep, the laundry room for his laundry, the kitchen to cook, and the showers to, well, you get the picture. All of his personal items were kept in truck. This lasted about 4 months before his coworkers caught on. His chief told him it wasn't a bad idea, but that it was time to move back into his own place. Story 5. A student was living in Los Angeles, in an apartment with a rent he could afford, but wanted to get a master's degree in engineering from the University of California at Berkeley. Because the Bay Area is one of the areas with the highest cost of living in the United States, the student decided to continue living in Los Angeles instead, and flew round-trip from KLAX to KSFO at least 3 times a week. For the entire academic year, he spent approximately $5,600 on his transportation, roughly equating to $650 a month. Quite an interesting story. Story 6. My file is a contractor. Thus, he has to buy lots of supplies. He buys gift cards first, then buys thousands of dollars worth of supplies on the cards. All so he can get the gas points. But because he has to buy so much for his business, it adds up hugely. He hasn't paid for gas in years. He also has to drive quite a bit, so it's a big money saver. Simultaneously, the biggest boomer move and the smartest cheating of the system I've ever seen. Story 7. Van-lifed while working as an electrician for C-SPAN on all the Navy boats. Saw my friend spending $1,602,000 a month in rent. Meanwhile, my rent was $80 insurance and about $300 in gas a month. Wife and I raked it in for about 2 years doing that. I love the lifestyle. So easy to maintain. We built a '93 Vandura high top during COVID. Still have the van for camping. It's awesome. Story 8. Friend of mine is a lifelong student. Whenever he has to cut hours to go back to school for another degree, he moves into his truck. Has been doing this for maybe 25 years now. Has it all kitted out and drives around the country doing rock climbing and studying while living in his truck. Has gym membership for showers and mobile hotspot for internet. Totally happy with it. Dude has so much charisma. Watching him flirt with a girl and offer a tour, then come back 40 minutes later with a big dumb grin is insane. When he was more local to me, we'd have him stay occasionally if he got sick or something because I didn't want him sick in his truck all by himself. Story 9. I got sick of paying rent, so I bought an RV and remodeled it to be a perfect bachelor pad. 40 inches TV surround sound, recliner chair, room for a stand-up jet ski. I paid someone in East Nashville $200 a month to park in their backyard and use their Wi-Fi. I saved up the rent I would have been paying and put a down payment on a duplex in 2016. It was a good call. Then I lived in half of the duplex and sold the RV for the same amount that I had into it. Around $3K. Story 10. Boldest is generally moving somewhere completely different, but cheaper. You never know if it'll work out, and it's harder to move back in some ways if it doesn't. I've done this, my sister did it, half our friends from our home state of California have done it. It worked out for most of us, but not all. Story 11. Do to think he did it to lower his cost of living, but a guy I worked with was sleeping in the woods behind the place we worked at. No tent, just a sleeping bag and a tarp. He would sneak into the building really early and use the showers in the mornings he worked. Don't know why he didn't sleep in his car in the parking lot. We later found out the guy had untreated mental illness. He was paranoid about the banks, would cash his entire check and hide any unspent money in his underwear, socks, and shoes, and that he was going to be locked into his apartment and imprisoned forever. Story 12. My older sister had my niece at 18. She used me as daycare for the entirety of her college education. I babysat 10 hours a day for my sister because she promised when she got her first job she'd split her first paycheck with me. I was in high school at the time and didn't have a third or fourth period, so I'd watch my niece from around noon till my sister got home. Unfortunately, when I brought up our agreement, she went like Jerry Springer crazy on me and called me everything from entitled to selfish. But hey, she got a good 3 years of free childcare from me, and now she's living with an abusive alcoholic, so I can't let her babysit my kids. Story 13. I can't say I've seen anyone do anything voluntarily. Living out of a car, semi-permanent resident at a campsite, these aren't things you do when things are going well for you. I like the van life idea, but you have to love in the right part of the country because you don't have cheap control of temp. Many of the cheap routes require a comfortable environment first, or it really starts to suck fast. You can certainly make do, but you're making real-life choices at that point. It also helps if the job allows it. Are you in a region, or is your travel and work sites conducive for such living? Or are you just sitting in Walmart parking lots all your life? There's very fitting situations. Story 14. Honestly, probably selling their gorgeous 5-bedroom house to downsize when they absolutely didn't need to. They were doing fine financially, but they basically eliminated having a mortgage by purchasing a smaller home outright with the equity they gained from their first home. It was a pretty baller move, in my opinion, considering most people are always looking to upgrade. Now they have no debt and are the only people I know with fairly standard jobs that aren't currently struggling. Story 15. A large family. When they would wash clothes in the washing machine, they would drain the rinse water into a utility sink. For the next load, used a submersible pump to pump it back into the washer for the next wash cycle. In other words, they would use the rinse water twice, first to rinse, then to wash the next load. They probably saved 50 gallons per load. Story 16. Moved into a tiny, crappy efficiency apartment with criminal neighbors just because it's cheap. He could easily afford a much better living situation where his car isn't repeatedly broken into and his Amazon deliveries aren't stolen, and property management actually fixes things. But it's not worth the extra few hundred a month to him. Story 17. An ex-colleague of mine got a job in Aberdeen, whilst his home continued to still be down in England somewhere. The company was aware, happy with this, but expected him to flat share in Aberdeen and fly home at the weekends, and even paid him small allowances to facilitate this. He instead set up camp in the woods nearby in a tent and would shower, etc. when he arrived in mornings pretending to have biked in. He then pocketed the extra allowances. Story 18. I sold my beautiful home in a nice area in Texas and paid cash on a 60-year-old house in the Midwest. I have 4 kids. 2 are starting college next year. Thankfully, they have it covered in scholarships, but looking at the housing market, they may need a place to live for a bit. This house has a basement apartment and plenty of room. Paying cash on this house reduced my $2,300 a month mortgage to 0. It reduced my property tax from $15,000 a year. Don't be fooled by Texas no income tax they get you on the property tax. Down to $2,500 a year. My electric bills for air conditioning a 3,600 SQ foot house in Texas were over $600 a month. Now my bill for the same size home is about $80. My heat bills during a winter with negative temps maxed out at $300 a month in the coldest month. We have arranged our lives so we can fully live on one income and bank the other for retirement and our kids' futures. The house isn't the showstopper we had in Texas. It's nice, but needs updating. Oh well, my bank account looks a lot better. Story 19. I got sick of continuously rising rents, moving rentals, and working full-time, so I bought a cheap houseboat and anchored it in the middle of the river in my city, close to everything and totally off-grid. There are no fees to anchor in the river, so besides the cheap cost of the houseboat and a kayak to get to and from, it was free. It was a bit inconvenient, but I did it for 5 years while working 4 days a week and saved up almost everything I earned. Just bought a house 50% cash a few years ago because of that houseboat stint. Story 20. A bit outdated now that newspapers aren't really a thing anymore. But I knew a guy in Los Angeles who would read the papers for delinquent property tax notices. He'd find a property that was empty and in a nice place in the Hollywood Hills. He'd keep an eye on it for a week or so to make sure it's really empty. Then he'd just move in. He'd clean the place up, hire gardeners to keep the bushes trimmed and the grass cut, and since he wasn't paying rent, he could afford to have repairs done. He even had the carpet replaced in one place. Eventually, the owner or property manager or a real estate person would show up, usually months or even years later, and call the cops on him. But he'd have a fake lease in hand, plus a stack of handwritten receipts for the cash rent he'd been paying monthly to the guy who rented it to me. He'd be very apologetic and understanding, and because he had proof that he was a tenant, it took at least 90 days to evict him. During that 90 days, he'd watch the papers for delinquent tax notices. He kept it up for like 10 years, until the real estate market got so hot that there simply weren't any empty places anymore. But he probably saved like $250,000 in rental expenses during that time, and really, he left those houses better than he found them. Story 21. This was something I actually did. For a while, I rented an apartment that was being managed a very incompetent real estate agency. Not only they were incompetent, but also shady as hell. By pure chance, I met someone who previously lived in my apartment and was cheated out of their 3-month deposit. They tried to sue the apartment owner but never managed as he lived abroad and was shielded by the shady real estate company. I was nervous to be screwed like they were once I had to leave the apartment. Luckily for me, the owner decided to sell it, and, being the epitome of incompetence, the agency couldn't find my rental contract anywhere to pass on to the new owner. They asked me directly how much rent I was paying and if I could change my rental payments from the old owner's bank account to the new one. Being presented with a golden opportunity, I took the risk and claimed my rent was €200 lower than it used to be, and promptly paid it to the new owner. No one said anything, and I kept paying on time at a discount for some 5 or 6 months. After that period, they started complaining that my rent was too low and ended up requesting an increase of an insane €500, €300 more than I was originally paying. I got a lawyer to write them a letter explaining all the ways that increase was illegal and kept paying at my discounted price. They didn't try to fight back, but were not happy. Since my contract was at risk of not being renovated, I graciously allowed them a €100 increase, which I guess was enough of a victory for the agency. It stayed like this for a couple more years, and I'm still amazed it worked. Story 22. I stopped going out to eat, stopped getting coffee to go, stopped going to movies and bars. Instead, I put that money into a non-locked, high-risk TFSA and use it for emergencies or traveling. I do lots of all-inclusives with flight packages and watch for the deals. Typically spend around 1,300 CAD for a week with a direct flight out of my city. It has been a life-changer for me. I learned to cook a larger variety of meals. It's helped with my weight loss. I've gotten to revisit countries I went to long ago and go to a couple of new ones. Even splurged and did a non-all-inclusive to a place I always had wanted to go to see an artist I have loved since I was a little girl in the 70s. I figure a couple of more trips and I will stop for a bit and just see what comes up that I may be interested in. The freedom to explore my interests has really improved my quality of life. Story 23. When my sister was a student, she would go around the local bakeries and supermarkets just before closing and ask if they had any food they were throwing out. The freshly made-in-store baked goods have a short shelf life, and whatever isn't sold by the end of the day is thrown out. The staff were always happy to throw it her way instead of into the bin out back. She would get clean garbage bags filled with food and take it back to her shared accommodation. Story 24. A friend of mine works as an on-call pharmacist. He goes to rural pharmacies and takes over for a few weeks to a few months when their pharmacist is out. He makes like $60 per hour. His wife works for a big oil company and based on her job, seems to make a very high wage too. He bought a $1,200 van and put a mattress in it. That's where he lives while he's working so he can pocket the per diem. Story 25. I think I might be a boldness contender here. I took a single payment divorce settlement worth about 30% of what I would have gotten monthly alimony, moved to a low COL area, and bought a cheap house with 2 residential and a commercial unit with the cash. I live in the tiny unit, and the other units will be rented soon, so I can enjoy painting my watercolors without stressing about surviving in the lean times between successes. I'm basically Mrs. Roper now. Story 26. So, not necessarily to lower their cost of living, more to improve their lifestyle. I knew a young woman who had been with the same man for years. They had 2 kids. They were both teen parents, but they were still an item into adulthood and they wanted to get married. But with them being low income, if they got married, they wouldn't qualify for certain benefits. So, the dad lived in a studio apartment a few neighborhoods away. He would wake up early so he could be at her place before the kids woke up and get them to school. He would put them to bed at night before going back to his apartment. This way, both he and his partner could qualify for certain scholarships to go to community college. They were both in school. They had a 4-year plan that involved each of them getting a business after finishing their 2-year degrees. The scholarships she received was only for single individuals, so since he had a separate apartment that he slept at, so she qualified. This way, they could both work and go to school. It was an extreme choice, but respectable IMO. They were just working towards providing a better future for themselves and their kids, and they recognized that an extreme approach would get them there faster. I haven't spoken to them in years. I hope they're winning. They certainly worked for it. Story 27. My wife and I got rid of lost all of our stuff, packed the rest into a storage unit, and moved out of our 5,000 square feet house and into a 30-foot travel trailer so she could be a traveling PTA. We went from something like $10K per month to $5K per month. We spend a lot less because there is no space to put stuff, so we don't buy stuff. Story 28. I've seen a dude basically just break up with a chick because he could not afford to go out on dates and do stuff. The bold part was that she was hot and really into him. She would have probably been okay with his situation, but she was so offended that he so methodically broke up over finances. She got pissed about it. Story 29. Used to work in the CPG industry, grocery stores. We did digital imaging and data scraping for e-commerce. It was cheaper for companies to send case packs than individual items, usually meaning we'd get cases of everything and anything you see in a grocery store. I didn't buy toilet paper for 8 years. Still have trash bags I got for free. Haven't worked there in over 3 years. I'm talking scallops, turkeys, soap, deodorant. My greatest haul was a $500 bottle of scotch. The job paid decent, but the free shit was insane. Story 30 smartest I saw was a manager of an apartment building I lived in. Had worked several decades in tech and gotten some sort of settlement. I assume had like $1 million in net assets, maybe less. One day while getting high, he explained he managed the building, got free rent plus a small stipend, like $500/mo or something. Building was all central utilities, so he only paid for cable internet. Worked a few gigs as a musician around town, but other than that lived off his investments. I met him mid-50s. He lived to be about 70 before passing. This is the answer if you ever get a large settlement. 1 mil at 3 to 5% is $30/50K/YR in income. If you don't pay for housing, then that is totally doable, especially if you are willing to take some side gigs. Only thing to watch out for is health costs in the US, but even $300-500/MO is doable with above budget. His biggest expenditures were weed and buying instruments as far as I could tell. Story 31. Literally everything I do is centered around not spending money or spending as little as possible. Everything I buy is store brand. I have the car have purely for how efficient the MPG is. I currently live in a camper, which saves a fuckload of money alone, on a small piece of land I own, and I pay roughly $120 a month for power until I decide what my next move is. I don't go out on weekends, mostly because I'm not social and have no actual friends. I have no wife or kids because I'm not yet in a position where I feel like I could support a family. I allow myself cheap little meals here and there, like a small dish at a local restaurant that only runs me about $12 plus a $5 tip. I have no idea how to spend money. There are so many things I'd like to do and have, but it just doesn't happen. My routine is literally sleep, work, gym, home, and repeat. It's a pretty boring life. I grew up poor, and I live far below my means because I want to climb higher and faster. I refuse to ever live like that again. Story 32. In a single month 10 years ago, I quit my job to change careers, received unemployment due to the employer admitting they asked me to forge documents, cashed out $401K to pay off all credit card, installment loan, and medical debt, was served divorce papers, and had the house foreclosed on by the bank. I went through a couple of very lean years, but getting away from a toxic relationship with a person who could only equate happiness with spending and material goods allowed me to focus on living responsibly. It was easy to scale back on almost every expense, set a budget, and live without undue financial stress for the first time in decades. Paring everything down to the barest of necessities felt amazing and allowed me to focus on life itself. Story 33. Eliminate debt. Like be compulsively allergic to it. Do not get loans of any kind. Buy your phone outright, buy your cars outright, buy your home outright, even if it's just a trailer to start and then work your way up. Because the sooner you eliminate monthly payments, you can snowball your savings and money stays in your pocket. People I know are just accustomed to debt. They lie to us and convince us we borrow money to buy a home that we own that home. No, sorry, you do not. You are paying that mortgage and interest for the privilege of occupancy of that home. That's the bank's. And if you fall on hard times, the bank will always come for its assets. The more you own outright, the better off you will be in life in the long run. If you have children, you should be doing what you can do, eliminate any debt for them as well. Story 34. Moved to China while building my online business to save money on cost of living and have a super high quality of life. 24/7 security at luxury apartment, fingerprint access for entry, $450/month. There's more to it, but saved a ton on self-employment taxes and lived a lifestyle equivalent to $300K salary in HCOL/VHCOL for $30K a year. Oh, and traveled a ton too. Super cheap to do so when you're already in SEE Asia. All the profits got funneled back to the business. I enjoyed QOL nicely. Bootstrapping didn't seem so bad. And I sold the biz 5 years later for a nice profit that allowed me to buy a house, set up a new biz in the US. Story 35. In college, people typically would buy a meal plan that provided them with more meals than they would eat in the semester. Towards the end of the semester, people had lots of meals left over. So my sophomore through senior year at the end of each semester, I would wait in line at the dining halls and ask people if they had any extra swipes and could swipe me in. Sometimes I would offer them $5, which they would always be more than happy to take for a swipe that would have cost me more than $10. Story 36. My acquaintance bought a 2-story house with a massive basement and a triple car garage, 1.5 bathrooms, 3 bedrooms, living room, kitchen, and whatever they turn that other room into. He has 2 roommates of whom are restricted to the 2 teeny tiny bedrooms that are obviously made for children. Can barely fit a bed in there. The roommates are only allowed to use the half bathroom, which doesn't even have a shower in it, just a toilet and what may or may not be a functional sink. They have to share 1 shelf in the fridge and 1 cabinet in the entire kitchen. Everything they own has to also be in the 1 tiny bedroom. They're not allowed to use any basement space or garage space or anything else in the entire house. My acquaintance charges them enough that their combined rent for living there pays more than his monthly mortgage costs. So he literally owns the house and lives there for free and makes a profit off of it. And by mortgage, I mean that also includes all utilities. So he literally pays absolutely nothing, but instead gets paid, it makes a profit off of living in his own house. I've tried to speak to his friends about the numbers and how they could live in their own apartment and have way more room and actually have places to put their stuff and be allowed to use the whole fridge and everything else. And they would be saving approximately $400 a month. Except as acquaintance of mine is one of those charming sort of people that everybody falls down on his feet and worships. So it doesn't matter how much he abuses people. They will still do it. But his cost of living has gone way down. He doesn't pay for his own house. He doesn't pay for any of his utilities. And he makes them buy all the food and then he eats their food. So he really has no cost of living.